Welcome to Our Canada, Our Future. I'm Aaron Woodrick. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about the recent decision of the Trudeau government to ban Huawei and ZTE, two Chinese technology companies, from accessing Canada's 5G wireless network. And to do that, I'm very pleased to be joined by Charles Burton, Senior Fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute and a former Canadian diplomat. Charles, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me on the show.
So Charles, maybe we should just start with the most obvious question. Why did the Trudeau government impose this ban? Are these not private telecommunication companies? So what's the point of having this ban?
Well, the question of their status with regard to the Chinese state is pretty clear. Huawei does claim to be a private company, but its ownership is connected to the trade union, which is under the control of the Chinese Communist Party. And even if it wasn't, it has a Chinese Communist Party branch at the apex of its management pyramid and is required under Chinese law and internal Chinese Communist Party practice to respond to any requests that the Chinese security or intelligence agencies might have of any Chinese citizen. So, the idea that Huawei could be potentially used by the Chinese state for Chinese state purposes of espionage, downloading databases, or providing the Chinese state with information about the critical infrastructure that our 5G technology will be controlling is definitely there. And so, like all of our like-minded allies, Canada has determined that the security risk of putting in the Huawei 5G is just too great, and in addition is requiring that the Huawei 4G equipment be removed from our telecommunications network. That equipment is dominant in the Bell and Telus networks.
Now, you mentioned our allies, Charles, having already done this. I know you and several other voices have been arguing that they should do this for years. What in your view took the Canadian government so long to reach this decision?
Well, I think there are a number of factors that don't really reflect very well on us. But of course, first of all, the Huawei equipment is priced at something like 30% lower than the Scandinavian competitors like Ericsson and Nokia. And that is due to extensive Chinese government subsidy of Huawei operations. So, from Bell and Telus's point of view, or SaskTel, or the other companies that have extensive Huawei installations, their primary duty is to their shareholders to maximize profit by buying the equipment at the most competitive price. They don't have a mandate for protecting national security. So there's certainly a lot of pressure to keep cell phone costs down to use the Huawei equipment. Secondly, I think there are a lot of companies in Canada, major important companies that engender employment and promote prosperity in our country, that have lucrative business arrangements with Chinese Communist Party business networks. And their business partners have made it clear, I think, to those companies that if they don't support the Chinese government's position that Huawei is an acceptable security risk to Canada, that the Chinese government will retaliate through economic coercion to make it clear to the government that if you don't follow the Chinese government's agenda in Canada, that there will be economic costs. So my speculation is that this lobbying has been very effective in constraining the government from making the right decision. But really, we should have made it a long time ago. Since we learned that the Huawei equipment poses an unacceptable security threat to our telecommunications networks, and we really were apprised of this, some years ago. And as you say, I highlighted this in a number of opinion pieces, newspapers. Telus and Tel have bought $700 million worth of equipment, and so now they're going to have to take that out, and the cost will come to the cell phone user, no doubt. So our high cell phone rates in Canada are going to go up, and I think we can attribute it really to government mismanagement.
Okay, yeah, that's an interesting point that you make, that there's a lot of other economic factors at play here, which may explain some of the reluctance, not just by the government itself, but with some other Canadian companies who benefit from sort of lower priced inputs. We're going to return to that economic theme in a second, but first we're going to take a short break. Welcome back to Our Canada, Our Future. We're talking with Charles Burton, Senior Fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, about the Trudeau government's ban on Huawei from our 5G network. Charles, I want to get into some of the economic ramifications, but I did want to sort of put to you, obviously the national security concern is that having the Chinese government have access to Huawei, have access to sort of spy on Canadians. How big a risk is this really? Are there examples that we know of, whether in Canada or elsewhere, where the Chinese government has been using these networks to spy? So just trying to quantify the scope of the risk.
Well, I think certainly the scope of the risk becomes much higher with the 5G technology, which, could be controlling autonomous vehicles or allowing for remote surgeries and that kind of thing. The technology is just fantastic and will become pervasive in all sorts of critical infrastructure and systems throughout Canada, regardless of whether it's supplied by Huawei or Nokia or Ericsson or Samsung. Unfortunately, we cannot supply it domestically because our Northern Telecom, Nortel, went bankrupt, and there are a lot of allegations that the reason that Nortel became non-viable was because so much of their technology had been hacked by Chinese sources. The building that Nortel was in, which is now Department of National Defense, couldn't be moved into by our government for a long time because they found so many surveillance devices in the walls. So pretty indicative of a serious problem there. But we have had extensive hacking of databases. There was a major hack of the Canadian government in 2011, which resulted in the Treasury Board and Finance Department being closed down for some weeks. And more recently, our government identified China in a hack of aerospace research at the National Research Council. But the bottom line is we don't know most of the cyber espionage that's going on using these networks because we can't track it. But the Communication Security Establishment, our government cyber agency, has identified that attempts at hacking go on every day, thousands of them. And a lot of Canadian businesses that have been hacked are reluctant to publicize that fact for fear of losing some competitive edge. So, it's no question that it's highly pervasive. And of course, it's not just the Chinese government that engages in cyber espionage, but using a company that's fully integrated into the Chinese state through the Chinese Communist Party, as Huawei is, just gives the Chinese government and regime and their other enterprises, such an edge that it's just not viable for us to have this 5G technology being controlled by a company that is so closely associated with the Chinese military and intelligence. So, the decision is the right decision. There are lots of reasons to be concerned. There have been backdoor routines discovered in telecommunications systems associated with Huawei in other countries. And so, this is something that we have to think about. And once you get the software and hardware solutions in, there's millions and millions of lines of code that really are hard to monitor by our monitoring facility. And there are also constant software upgrades, which allow the capability for malicious code to be put in.
Right. So, given the scope of the risk as you've outlined it, do you think that this goes far enough? Do you think that there's other steps, are there other companies or other measures that the government needs to take to protect Canadians?
Well, yes, I think that we really have to be looking at securing our supply chains. And I was pleased to see that the government adopted the recommendation to Parliament by me and many others with much more authority on this matter with regard to critical minerals. And the government has put, I think it's $13.8 billion over 8 years into trying to better exploit the critical minerals resources available in the Canadian North, because we don't want to be in a position where for things like high-tech batteries and computer chips and so on, that we are dependent on Chinese close to monopolistic control of some of these minerals. China has them domestically and also has gained control of mines in Africa and other parts of the world that could give them considerable economic coercion if we needed minerals that we are unable to access from another source. So, I mean, that's certainly one thing. And there are a lot of other areas of Chinese investment that we have to be looking at. We did not allow the Chinese state construction firm to acquire Aecon, our largest privately owned construction firm, because of fear of what that might imply for a knowledge of infrastructure.
Okay, great thoughts, Charles. We're going to take a short break and be right back. Welcome back to Our Canada, Our Future. We're talking with MLI Senior Fellow Charles Burton about the Trudeau government's decision to ban Huawei from Canada's 5G network. Charles, I did want to touch on, of course, something involving Huawei that was not about the 5G network. That was, of course, Canada's decision to arrest, at the request of the United States, a Huawei executive, which, of course, led to the retaliatory detention of two Canadians, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor. Do you think that that sort of saga and the fact that Huawei and a Huawei executive was part of it, did that factor in at all to the government's decision to finally ban Huawei from the 5G network?
Well, I think it might have factored into some degree of the delay in making the decision, or at least the government claims that they were reluctant to make a decision while China was holding two hostages to try and coerce our government to overrule our normal judicial process with regard to assessing foreign governments' extradition requests with those governments that we have bilateral extradition treaties. So, there was I think some factor there. But, in addition to the hostage diplomacy, let's bear in mind that China also imposed economic coercion by canceling canola seed contracts for import of canola seeds from Canada into China, a $30 million a year agricultural commodity business, and also on spurious grounds banned some meat, primarily from Quebec, from entering the Chinese market. So, it does show that we cannot trust China to uphold its international obligations, either in terms of its obligations to the UN, human rights, and so on. Hostage diplomacy, holding people without due process of law, without clear charges, is clearly against international norms. And then again, violation of the spirit of the WTO by canceling those contracts to pressure us on political matters. None of our other canola customers had any problems with our canola seeds. The dockage is meeting international standards. That's the non-seed portion. And more recently, China has resumed importation of Canadian canola seeds because they have a shortage of those seeds in China, and they've given up on any suggestion that there's anything wrong with our canola seeds, which is a fine product. So, it is indicative of, in general, difficulties in us engaging in fair and reciprocal relations with the People's Republic of China, and the need for us to diversify to more trustworthy partners who will play by the defined rules of the game of the international rules-based order.
I want to sort of expand on that a bit, the economic theme, because there are a lot of people, as you probably know, make the argument that China is just a huge economic boon to Canada. We do a lot of business there. We feel the pain, as you mentioned, a number of examples, if we anger them. So what do you say to those folks who say, look, there's a lot to be gained by doing business with this regime. We don't have to like them, but if we sort of keep our head down and don't poke the bear, we stand to gain a lot in terms of trade.
Well, I think the primary issue is that China is a different sort of regime from ours and is therefore incompatible. China is able to use cyber espionage to further the interests of Chinese state companies, whereas, Canada would never use espionage to assist, say, BlackBerry in knowing what their competitors are doing in terms of new technologies or in terms of competitive bids. We just don't have that kind of integrated civil, military, political party regime. So any dealing with China does open us to the possibility of economic coercion or, you know, um, kidnapping of Canadian business people in China on false charges to induce them to release their proprietary manufacturing processes or intellectual property. It's just very challenging. But I think the larger issue is that Canada is not that dependent on the Chinese market. It's only about 4% of our external commodities trade. And this is mostly agricultural commodities and minerals for which there is a global market. So it is possible for us to diversify our exports away from China without suffering enormous economic costs. And I think that this is the direction that we and our allies will be taking in future, is that unless China is prepared to play fairly in terms of trade and diplomacy, then we just have to give them a timeout until such time as they recognize that if they don't play by the rules, they're not going to get the economic benefits that we offer to them through trade.
Yeah, that's a fair point. It's not so much use doing business with a partner if they're not actually going to honor the contracts that you have with them. And so it is a bit of an illusion that we're losing much if we're always putting ourselves at risk anyway. We're going to take a short break and be back with Charles Burton in a few moments. Welcome back to Our Canada, Our Future. We're talking with Macdonald-Laurier Institute Senior Fellow Charles Burton about the Trudeau government's decision and Huawei from Canada's 5G wireless network. Charles, I wanted to touch on a piece that you've written recently, sort of framing this decision in the context of the war in Ukraine and sort of what this has changed in terms of the geopolitical landscape. Do you think that it's a bit of a reality check for Canada in terms of sort of the risks we face, given the sort of concerns that we have about regimes that, shall we say, don't deal above board as partners?
Yes, I think that the war in Ukraine has given us insight into the future, which is that any illusions that we had that Russia and China would respect the norms of diplomacy, sovereignty, territorial integrity, and not the peace, the self-determination of peoples in determining whether they, in the case of Ukraine, wish to become a democratic state based on the Ukrainian language and culture, or to become a subsidiary of a new Russian empire, has been shattered. And I think that with regard to both Russia and China, while those regimes have not changed in their nature, as you pointed out, I've been sounding the alarm on Russia and China for some years in all sorts of fora. I think at the time, people probably regarded me as alarmist. Maybe, I'm seen as more prescient, but the message seems to be getting through. And I think that our government and our allies are going to start getting much more serious about protecting our sovereignty and security from the threat that these autocratic regimes play, until such time as we see regime change in Russia and China, which leads to regimes which are prepared to respect the liberal principles that underlie the global security and peace and prosperity that have served Canada so well since the end of the Second World War.
Now, Charles, you mentioned the war sort of being a reality check and a sort of a preview of what's to come in the future. There are a number of multilateral initiatives that Canada has sort of been left on the sidelines for, in Asia Pacific, for example, the Quad initiative and the security arrangement between Australia, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom and the United States. Are you optimistic that Canada is sort of waking up to this now? Are you seeing changes in terms of policy and the rhetoric coming out of the government, that they understand that something needs to change?
I don't think that we're understanding it enough. And the one you're referring to, the AUS UK US actually does not include New Zealand, which suggests that the Five Eyes, which is Australia, New Zealand, UK, Canada, and US, seems to be turning into Three Eyes, which is Australia, UK, and the US. And I think it's because Canada is just not seen as a reliable partner. There's people in Ottawa who think that they are smart and sophisticated and can somehow steer a middle path between relations with China and relations with the United States. And I think our reluctance, including, our very substantial delay in doing the right thing with regard to Huawei, has caused us to be perceived as an unreliable partner in global affairs, and we are being marginalized. And, until we demonstrate to our allies that we are more than just virtue signaling and words, but that we're prepared to put substantive resources into bolstering our defense, including defense of the Arctic, and substantial resources into our participation in meaningful ways in global institutions, including enacting legislation similar to that of Australia with regard to foreign influence penetration in our senior elite, and in terms of not giving into Chinese coercion, that Canada will become a lesser and lesser player and suffer more and more security consequences as our allies just aren't able to be there for us if we're not there for them.
Yeah, fair enough. Sort of 10 seconds. Is it fair to say that Canada sort of has to pick a lane? We can't sort of, the world's polarizing and we sort of have to choose. It's going to be our allies or the folks on the other side?
Absolutely. We cannot build our prosperity with unprincipled relations with China. We have to ally with our like-minded allies and start to act in concert to try and preserve the international rules-based order.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Charles. That was a wonderful discussion on a very important topic that I think impacts all Canadians. I want to thank you for joining us, and I want to thank you, the viewer. We'll see you on the next episode of Our Canada, Our Future.